Thanks for being here today. My name is Kevin Conover, and I'm your host on Educate for Life Radio. We're broadcasting still on the radio down here in Southern California, KPRZ 1210 AM. We're also on FM 106.1 in North County. And then, of course, we're podcast on Spotify and all the other podcast platforms. So my guest today is Blake Blake Togerson. He's a former student of mine and also a very successful young businessman already. Blake, thanks for joining in here.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited. It's going to be
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, it's really cool. And we're going to be, if you didn't know, we're going to be talking about theistic evolution and also six-day creation. And Blake, you go to Point Loma Nazarene, is that correct?
Yes, sir. I'm a business management student over here.
Yeah, yeah. And so you read the book, The Fool and the Heretic. I believe that's your professor. Is that your professor at Point Loma Nazarene, who is Daryl Falk? Is that correct?
No, so he is close friends with Daryl Falk. My professor is Dr. Michael Lodahl,
Oh, okay.
genius guy. Love him. And again, like a collaborator with Falk. But I've read two of Falk's works now, and Fool and the Heretic is co-authored by Daryl Falk, who is of the side of Theistic Evolution, and Todd Charles Wood, who is the young Earth creationist. And they have this dialogue within this book, and I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, and so I've read the majority of the book since you referenced it. I was very curious to hear what the people have to say, and it is an interesting book. It's definitely a different approach, more of a discussion, sharing their background, and it's more personal. It's less of a debate and more of a why are you where you're at kind of book, with both people sharing their viewpoints, which is really interesting. Um, and so I think it's an interesting book to read. Um, but for those of you listening, I was Blake's 12th grade Bible apologetics teacher, and I'm not sure how much we got into the age of the earth discussion or not. What year did you graduate?
So I graduated in 2022, and we didn't talk a whole lot about the origin of mankind itself. I'm not actually super familiar with what you believe or what your stance is on that. So I'm
Yeah.
interested to have that discussion.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so that's what we're going to do here is we're going to discuss this and you're kind of you're not completely decided, is that correct? But you're kind of leaning towards theistic evolution. Is that your position?
I'm kind of against the idea of being completely decided in general.
Yes.
I think in terms of leaning, I have my leanings toward a more theistic evolutionary side. And I have some evidence on my little evidence sheet right here. Just
Speech and
kind of go
debate.
through.
Speech and debate.
Yeah, speech and debate right there. And I think Genesis 1 and 2, and I'll kind of give a direct quote from Dr. Lodahl. I think
Yeah.
Genesis 1 and 2, in the context I understand it, shouldn't be read in a literalist context. And for good reason. I think it's because they're two very different creation stories. So the conflict that I had when reading Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 is there's deviations within the story itself. So I'm saying, okay, well, I believe in the inerrant word of God, that it is divinely inspired, that it is, his word, and there's no mistakes. Like Genesis 1 and 2, they're not, retconning one or the other. But which is the scientific description? And when we come into that debate with the context of which one is scientifically correct, we run into a lot of issues. So I started understanding, becoming more scientifically literate, and picking which one is literal in the sense of how we came to be. I ran into some insoluble difficulties. So the idea is Genesis 1, based on the context in which it was written, and I believe it's widely agreed upon that Moses wrote Genesis, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So the context in which that was written, at the time in which it was written, Genesis 1 seems to function as more of a hymn to the creator, and Genesis 2 seems to function as more of a parable. And in the context in which these were written and at the time, that seems to line up pretty well. And evidence of that is within the text itself. And again, the context in which they were written. So I kind of took this idea of, okay, well, which one is right? And I believe they're both correct, but don't function as a literalist description of how we came to be. And then getting into the science of how did we come to be, which we'll talk on after I give you a second to respond to that.
Sure, sure. So
Super.
I am a 6-day creationist. I believe that Genesis 1 is more of a broad overview than Genesis 2 is getting down into more details. But I mean, a big part of the reason that I believe what I do, there's both the scientific side, and then there's also, of course, the theological side, which is, hermeneutics. How do you read Genesis 1? And, the genre, you said Genesis 1 looks like a hymn. And of course, the genre of what you're reading is going to affect whether it's metaphorical, whether it's an allegory. What is it? In the New Testament, Jesus uses parables frequently in order to describe the kingdom of heaven is like. And so the question becomes, what are the words and other details of Genesis 1, 2, and actually Genesis 1 through 11 is frequently. So, for example, Darrell Falk in the book The Fool and the Heretic, he says Genesis 1 through 11 is all more of a story that's meant to illustrate a point, but not actually to be taken literally. It's interesting because he says he's not opposed to a literal Adam and Eve, although he believes that we evolve, that God used evolution to cause us to evolve. And I always try to tell people, because people often say, couldn't God have used evolution to create everything? But the real question isn't really whether God could have. The question is, did he? And I think it's important to point out that this is not a matter of salvation. So a lot of people will say, well, it's not a salvation issue, therefore it doesn't matter. But there's a lot of things in scripture that aren't salvation issues, but they still matter. So, for example, the virgin birth. If somebody doesn't believe in the virgin birth, it's not as if that was a qualification for being able to go to heaven. And so there are still things that are very, very important. They actually affect the way people think about the scriptures. And so the discussion we're having, I think, is a significant one. The Presbyterian Church USA, it's the largest Presbyterian denomination. I think it's shrunk quite a bit, but they adopted evolution as their perspective. And this also, it looks like, led to more leniency when it comes to things like adopting same-sex pastors who have same-sex attractions, as well as saying that abortion is okay. And so for a lot of people, they say, well, look, if you take this aspect of scripture and you allegorize it, well, you have the potential of allegorizing other things for the same reason. So a lot of what I'm looking at is, I don't think that the genre in Genesis 1 and 2 and 1 through 11 is actually any kind of allegory or metaphor. It looks to me like it's being treated as history because Jesus treats it as history. He says in the beginning, he made them male and female. And then you have situations where there are other references to the beginning of creation that seem to be referencing it as a literal historical record. But go on and make your point that you're making here.
Sure. So a couple things to unpack with what you said. The first thing is
Sure.
I kind of get this idea of, okay, so if we, as the Presbyterian Church, for example, allow for, evolution to be taught and understood, it creates a slippery slope effect. So that, okay, well, if this is allegorized, then perhaps this is, and if this is okay, then perhaps this is. So if we don't take everything the Bible says at face value in a literal sense as we understand it in 2024, then it can create a slope into other sin. I'd like to push back on that a little bit, because
Well, that's not really what I'm saying, though. So
okay,
what I'm
then help me understand that.
just to clarify. So I wouldn't say, hey, let's believe that Genesis is literal so we can stop other people from, sinning or something. What I'm saying is that your method of interpretation needs to be consistent, because if your method of interpretation is arbitrary, then what happens is you can allegorize any portion of scripture that you potentially want to. So I'm not saying I think we need to believe it in Genesis 1 as literal because it will prevent people from sinning. I'm saying that if you don't have a consistent method of interpretation, the Bible essentially becomes putty in your hands. You can make it say whatever you want. So you have to have a hermeneutic that is consistent, meaning if the Bible expects you to take something literally, you take it literally. If the Bible expects you to take something figuratively, you take it figuratively. Of course, in Proverbs, it says that wisdom is a woman. And this is where Solomon is talking to his son, and he's contrasting wisdom as a woman, because young men are attracted to women, right? Versus things like prostitution and sexual immorality. So he's contrasting these two females. Of course, it doesn't mean that wisdom is literally a woman, but that's very clear in the text, the way he's talking. Versus Genesis 1 through 11, I would say is definitely not speaking in the genre of poetry. That's kind of where I'm going. So
I think that's where the disagreement comes in, because when I read that, I see, okay, we're talking about God slayed a Leviathan. He spoke over formless void to create the earth, right? That is far more not literalist language. So when I'm reading Genesis and I'm saying, okay, the Lord overcame this mention of the Leviathan.
that's in Job. That's in the book of Job.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And
But
that
in
and there
terms of
what it says is he can approach the Leviathan and not be afraid.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
But I think even in Genesis, in terms of like speaking over formless and void, that language, myself and I think Dr. Lodahl and Daryl Falk read that as, not literalist. So in terms of like reading the Bible, and there's different genres in the Bible, if what you're saying is we have to read everything in like a conform hermeneutic, as in one type of what would be the word genre. So it's either everything's literalist or everything's not. I think Genesis is one of those books that is more allegorical, and just based on the cultural context of the text and the evidence within it. So
Now, are you
that's,
talking about Genesis 1 through 11, or are you talking about the whole book of Genesis? Because that also has the whole thing with
I think
Joseph in Egypt. And
for the context of this, we'll say Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 serves the purpose of being a hymn to God. And that's kind of the way that I've read that, and the way that many of
so
these other. Go
can
ahead.
I ask you a question about that?
Of course.
So how would you deal with things like where Jesus references um, this, where he says, "In the beginning, he made them male and female," um, and that reference. Do you think that Jesus is because he's referencing clearly Adam and Eve? What do you do with that in that kind of a situation? How do you handle that?
Well, I think there's an interesting. So I remember you mentioned missing links one time,
Mhm.
and there's no direct evidence that you and I came from primates. That I haven't seen any direct evidence for that you and I have evolved from monkeys.
I agree with
Um,
you. Yes.
so so I'm not going to claim that you and I came from monkeys. And I think it actually makes sense. And Falk kind of references this too, if he's not opposed to the idea of an Adam and Eve. But then I'll see like vestigial structures and genes that we don't use anymore. I'm going to reference specifically whales have a
Now what?
pelvic
Now,
bone.
okay. Now I
Go
gotta
ahead.
wait. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure I'm
Sure.
tracking with you here,
Yeah.
because Jesus says, "In the beginning, He made them male and female." But if what Daryl Falk is saying is that's actually not the beginning. The beginning started. So he's okay with an Adam and Eve, but he's saying the beginning happened a long time ago. Are we just saying that Jesus misspoke in this situation, or what are we
I think it's
saying
how
here?
you read it. Is it the beginning of Earth, or is it the beginning of mankind? Oh, we
Well,
gotta
that would that
join.
if you're a Jewish, boy growing up in Israel at the time of Christ, it's well known among Hebrews, among Hebrew scholars, that they believe the 6 day of creation was a literal creation. They didn't this now we could say, okay, maybe they misunderstood science, but this is what they really took. I mean, in the Hebrew lexicon, it specifically says that yes, 6 days. And there
Are
are
you
many Jewish
referencing
scholars.
Yom?
I'm referencing Yom, but more importantly, what I'm referencing is that it would be very it would be very strange for a Hebrew boy in first century, Palestine to think that that wasn't 6 days, to say, oh, no, 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 that's not the beginning. The beginning was far before that. So that just wouldn't be the case.
I
Jesus
think
looked, yeah,
to that
go ahead.
point though,
Yeah.
at the same time, like this young Hebrew boy years and years ago that you're referencing, is they didn't even know that we revolved around the sun. So in general, I don't think that the Bible functions or was written to function as a book of science as we understand it, as more as it is written so that we may understand God and we may
But do you
understand
think
how to be a better
Jesus,
Christian.
but do you think Jesus' words are actually authentic? Do you think that's what he said in the
As
beginning? He made them
in,
male and female, referencing the 6 days of creation.
I don't think he was referencing a direct. I don't. I'm having trouble seeing the correlation between in the beginning God made man, right? The literal words he's saying, and but God made
Male and
man in
female.
6 days in six 24-hour periods as we understand it today. Like I don't see the
I'm
direct
I'm
link to that.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that if Jesus is referencing this as an actual historical event that actually took place, how would you deal with that as somebody like Daryl Falk, who says, no, no, that's not actually the beginning. There was another beginning that took place. Or would you say Jesus misspoke? Or I just feel like it would be very difficult for me personally to read that and then say, well, either Jesus made a mistake, Jesus, I don't know what I would say. I'm taking him at
I
his
don't think
word.
I'd ever claim that Jesus made a mistake.
No, no, you
What,
never did. You never did.
yeah, and what I would claim though is that we may have made a mistake in understanding what he meant. As in the beginning of God's reaction or God's interaction with mankind itself, right? So Adam and Eve itself. There's another popular theory that between like day four, millions of, or potentially billions of years could have passed. And I'd like to get into the actual science behind why I think the Earth is old as it is. And I'd
Yeah.
love to hear your rebuttals to these or this supposed evidence that I've seen.
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
now would even be a good transition into that.
Okay.
Radiometric dating. Um, we're able to detect how old like specific meteorites or sedimentary layers or rocks are based on the half-life of the uranium in it. So we
Yes.
have tons of samples now, up into the hundreds of rocks that appear to be 4.5 to 4.6 billion years old. So my question there is, okay, this is a repeatable, observable science that suggests an old Earth. If the Earth isn't actually that old, why would God seemingly deceive us into, we have a testable, observable, and repeatable process that's suggesting an old Earth? Why does it appear that way if the Earth isn't actually that old?
Well, I would say that God is not trying to deceive anybody. I would just say the devil is trying to deceive people because the devil is a liar. And so he's going to take something that, if explained properly, wouldn't be a problem. And he's going to twist it and do what he can to try to manipulate people to think things that aren't true. And I think he does that all the time. Um, so, radioisotope dating, I've interviewed quite a few people on this, including people who have worked directly in radioisotope labs, actually measuring the amount of parent and daughter isotopes in things like carbon 14, uranium, potassium, argon, rubidium, strontium, all these sorts of things. So the difficulty is that it's very inconsistent. So if you take these rocks and you do them, there's a lot that goes into that. So I interviewed this guy and he said, look, when you take a rock to one of these labs, you have to write in how old you think it is. And he goes, and they literally play with the dials until these come out right. He also said that, there's a tremendous amount of inconsistency. So, for example, if you bring a rock to a lab, you have to assume the amount of parent and daughter isotopes that the rock started with. So, what I mean by that is, let's say you're doing something like potassium argon. You have to assume the amount of potassium that started in the rock and the amount of argon that's in the rock. Because if you don't know the initial conditions, then there's no way to tell how much of potassium has changed into argon because you don't know what it started with. So you have to assume that. And then the second assumption you have to make is that all the daughter atoms, meaning all the argon, came from radioactive decay in that rock, where in fact you can actually have tons of contamination. So water leaching in and out of the rock can actually pull in and pull out isotopes, which will change. So it's like a contaminated rock. You don't know if it's been constant the whole time. And the rate can change because potassium argon has a crazy huge half-life. And so you're assuming that the rate that you see right in front of you has been constant forever. And they've only been doing this for about 100 years. And you're trying to extrapolate that out billions of years. So there's three big assumptions you have to make, and none of those assumptions are provable. And so you have a really difficult time. Now, I'm not saying that radioisotope dating isn't reliable in the sense that they can't accurately measure the isotopes in the rock. They actually can, and it's actually it's done very well. But what they can't do is prove those three assumptions: initial starting conditions, no contamination, and a constant rate of decay. They can't do it. There's literally no way to go back in time and figure that out. And along those same lines, I'll give you one of the evidences that radioisotope dating actually proves the Earth is young. They've done this. C14, because of its half-life, changes into N14. So what happens with C14 is its half-life is relatively short compared to many of these other isotopes. It can only last a maximum of 200,000 years. And so the United States Geological Survey was digging out, like they drill down these wells, right? They go way, way down deep in the earth. And what they were able to do was pull diamonds out of the earth and also pull rocks from way down to the earth. So if you look at the strata, as you go down in the strata, the carbon-14 should get lower and lower the farther down you go, because supposedly the farther down in the strata you are, the older it is. So if C14 has been, these layers are laid down over billions and millions of years, at the bottom, you should have no C14 at all. And you should see a consistent pattern of increasing C14 as you move up in the layers. Well, what they actually found, and this was done, again, these were pulled from the United States Geological Survey. What they actually found was a consistent amount of C14 from the bottom all the way to the top. And what that actually means is, first of all, the Earth can't be over 200,000 years old. And second of all these layers were laid down successively in a very quick manner, right? Which would justify the worldwide flood. What's that?
I said that'd be the flood, and then you said that'd be the
exactly. Yeah. The other thing they did was that when they got the diamonds down in the lowest layers, like literally diamonds are supposed to have been made at the very beginning of Earth history, crushed by the layers. So what they expected was no C14 in the diamonds. And they ended up, and diamonds can't be contaminated. That's the other thing, because diamonds are so hard, you can't have water leach things in and out. So they know that whatever's in there is original. So they expected no C14 in diamonds because these are supposed to be millions of years old. Well, what they ended up finding was plenty of C14 in the diamonds, again, proving that there's no way the Earth can be over 200,000 years old, or that C14 should all be gone. So I actually think radioisotope dating is incredibly supportive of a recent creation. Yeah.
Interesting. Because what I've read is it doesn't mention a lot of that. And the available data to our, even just Google, like how accurate is radioisotope dating? Does radioisotope dating suggest a 4.5 billion year old Earth? The stuff that's going to come up is yes. And I see radiometric dating is highly accurate for determining the age of rocks, with error margins typically between 2 and 5%. So what I'm reading, the published and peer-reviewed things that I'm reading are, hey, we've done this with tons and tons and tons of specimens, and many of them suggest that, the oldest ones that we found in meteors, which I think is a really interesting one, suggests that the world is, the oldest ones are 4.5 to 4.54 billion years old. So that's super. I hadn't heard of what you said before.
Yeah, and I have actually quite a few other examples of this. So another data set, they actually did radioisotope dating on rocks coming out of Mount St. Helens. So what they wanted to do was, they said, look, we've got a rock here that was created by Mount St. Helens. It's only 10 years old. They took it to the lab, didn't tell them it's only 10 years old, and asked them. It ended up dating into the billions of years old. So there's something wrong here. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with the three unprovable assumptions, which are you have to know the initial conditions, which obviously that rock was contaminated, right? But the question then becomes how many other rocks are contaminated that you're dating, right? People might say, well, it's just that rock that was contaminated, but you don't know because you weren't there. So how are you going to prove that? That's the real difficulty with radioisotope dating. They also dated two parts of a mammoth. I have the details on this. And the mammoth dated thousands of years different from its skin to other parts of it. And so, again, clearly there's something that's not lining up here with that. Again, I do believe that they can accurately measure the isotopes within the rock or within the bone, but those three unprovable assumptions create a pretty big problem if you don't have some other tool by which to gauge it. And usually what they do is they'll say, this rock was found in this strata. So let's say I find a rock in a strata that's 200 million years old. So what I take it to the lab and I say, this was found in strata 200 million years old. They go, oh, if they get things that are off that, then they fiddle with the knobs until they get something that's accurate. And then they go, okay, yeah, the rock is blah, 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 blah. But it's based off of the scientist first telling them, here's where I found it. That's why I think it's this old. And then they work on that. And I know that sounds crazy because it's like, what? But on one of my podcasts, I actually interviewed a physicist who this is what he did all the time. He worked in the largest radioisotope, the most well-known, I believe it's in New York, most well-known radioisotope lab in the world. And purposely was trying to figure out what is going on and would bring in rocks, not tell the right ages, not tell the right layers, and get completely different numbers than what, he knew to be true about that rock or whatever it is. So
where would I go to find the information on the Mount St. Helens case and woolly mammoth case you specifically referenced?
I can
hadn't
actually
found it before.
Yeah. So there was a project done called the RATE project, RATE. This was done by a bunch of PhD scientists. They're all creationists, and they set out to specifically deal with radioisotope dating. Their goal was to figure out what is going on here. And just look up RATE. I've interviewed multiple. One is a geophysicist. There's a bunch of geologists on this, all PhD scientists that worked on this project. It was an 8-year project that they were specifically identifying these things. One of their biggest findings that they absolutely 100% confirmed was that depending on the environment of the rock, the rate of decay actually changes. And so what that means is really throws off, because if you're extrapolating back billions of years, there's just no way you can say that the rate is constant. It's not possible.
That's really interesting. And I think my initial antenna went up there when I heard, okay, 8 creationists and they're going out, and chances are they're being funded to go find that conclusion. So
Well, this is a difficulty, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's funded by somebody who
That
has
wants
an
to find a
interest.
conclusion.
Exactly. And so that's why it's so important to look at the data and say, okay, is this trustworthy data? But the sad reality is that no matter where we go, the information is biased. And so we just have to do the best we can to keep digging until, we're able to make a good informed decision. But I recognize that. It's really funny because creation.com actually has a page dedicated to these are bad arguments. Like it's this huge page of bad science, bad science, bad science. And it's all on them. They're saying, do not use this argument. This is not a good creation argument. You need to get rid of this. This is baloney. And so you're right in saying that, people are biased. So I can
and I don't want to say that as to discredit them, because the same comes from, the evidence that I've got from as well. But I do think there's something to the degree of like, we have this very large portion of the scientific community, many of which I'd say are more unbiased than 8 creationists being funded to go find something to support that.
Well, I would disagree with that.
You again, not, and again, like the not to say that all secular science is going to be. I'd say the majority of it is with a large bias.
Well, there is a huge website. It's a secular website, not a Christian website. It's called Retraction Watch. I stumbled on it one time when I was doing research.
Never heard
It's
of
a
it.
it's a site dedicated to all the fraud in science. This is not a Christian website. These are guys that got sick of finding out that things weren't true that had been studied, and they list all the people that are either put on probation, their journal articles are retracted, there's people that are put in prison falsifying data. One of them I was reading falsified data. He had $2.1 million in grants, and
Yeah.
he was motivated by that grant money. And so it was actually a cancer research professor, sadly, who's drumming up data just so he can keep the grants coming in, and ended up being put in prison for that. So
Yeah. That's how that happens. Yeah.
yeah, pretty
Really
wild.
interesting though. I'm not familiar with the cases you have presented at all. So I'm gonna get educated on that. I think the next thing that I'm interested in is the idea of these vestigial structures that we see in whales that suggest that they come from land mammals because they're entirely not used. The pelvic bone specifically I'm referencing. And there's also these
Now
genes.
you're talking about what look like leftover legs in whales.
Yeah, it's a pelvic bone that like doesn't work. It doesn't function for anything. And then
Okay,
there's
so
old
just so you
factory.
know, as far as I know on that one, that's actually those there's no evidence that those are leftover legs. That was debunked quite a while ago. What that actually is it's a pivot point for reproduction. So if they didn't have those, the whales actually couldn't pivot in order to, that's kind of graphic.
Mhm.
It's
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
whales' ability to have sex. And without that, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So
I heard that and I kind of went down that rabbit hole there, but I didn't see any sufficient evidence that to suggest that they actually work in that manner. It's more of a theory that's, this is what they're used for, but no actual direct link to the use case there. Um,
I'll look that up a little further, but I'm pretty sure
yeah.
that's the case. It's in I believe porpoises, dolphins, killer
I'll send you the
whales,
link to
big
my
whales
finding
too.
on that as well, so you can kind of
Yeah,
see where I'm coming from in that regard.
sure.
And then the other thing is stellar development. I think that's the third uh, big piece of evidence that is constantly presented to me for an old Earth idea, and the parallax method. And these are hard things to understand. Are you familiar with stellar development and the parallax method in terms of understanding the Earth's position of our orbit to see stars that are light years and light years and light years away? We wouldn't be able to see these stars if the Earth wasn't X amount of years old because of the time it would take light to travel to us.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with this discussion, but I would say there's pretty good answers to this. They're theoretical, but I think the answers are sufficient. So can you break that down a little bit just so our listeners know what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'll try to make it super simple. And again, I'm not
Sure.
an astronomer, so
No,
bear
that's
with
okay.
me
Yeah.
here. But the idea is as the Earth rotates around the sun, we're able to, in certain positions of the Earth's orbit around the sun, the refraction of light off of it, we're able to see different stars from galaxies away at different points. And these stars, like with the technology we have now, um, we shouldn't be able to see them because light wouldn't have traveled to us in 6,000 years, if that makes sense.
Yes,
So
it does.
the distance of these stars, if the Earth was only 6,000 years old, we shouldn't be able to see them because light shouldn't have traveled to us in that amount of time. And to that point, there's not a lot of astronomers that are young Earth creationists, but a lot of the astronomers, a lot of them end up taking a more theistic evolutionary side, which is interesting because they don't necessarily take an atheist side. But a lot of these guys are on the side of, hey, this is really interesting. This is really compelling evidence. And that leads them down into the, we can't be here without some form of divine and like specific creation.
Yeah, yeah. I actually have a show coming up where I'm interviewing a cosmologist who has documented all the different Christian basically, astronomers and so forth who have studied space. That's coming up, I think, in like 2 weeks. But but so so I've interviewed cosmologist, physicist, Jason Lisle. You may have heard of him. I don't know, but he's pretty well known among creationist circles, and he is pretty prolific in his writing. He's done tons of things. One of the big things that came out recently was the James Webb Telescope. I actually interviewed him on that because he specifically talks about when they put the James Webb Telescope out in space. It's the most powerful telescope that's ever been built. And they thought we're going to be able to see to the beginning, the origins of the universe, because the farther you can see into space, what they believe is the farther back in time you can see. And so they had postulated, okay, what we're going to see are, we're going to see a pattern of star age as you move out. Well, it turns out the pattern was completely false. And Jason Lisle had predicted what would be seen if creation was true, and it turned out it was exactly the same, which was a uniform like layout of the stars with different ages all over the place. So there was no pattern of young to old or old to young. It was just all kinds of stars with all different ages in their, well, what they call ages, but the postulate is a star changes color over the span of its age. And
Correct.
as it burns out, right, it changes color. And so what they saw were many stars in different stages of, supposed star age kind of development. And it debunked, it really frustrated a lot of people. A lot of the Big Bang proponents were extremely frustrated by this because they said this is completely messing up the theory of the Big Bang.
As in like
So
Big Bang, and so the singularity theory, which is like a cosmic
yes,
microwave background that suggests that we expanded from a very hot, dense state over a time. So it would be uniform of, you know,
so
old.
basically what the Bible says is that God created all the universe, in a day,
Yeah.
the stars, right? So what he's arguing is that's actually accurate. It's an accurate depiction of what we actually see in there, right? So now regarding starlight, what this just so disclaimer, this is purely theoretical. It's an
Yeah.
attempt to explain why we can see starlight, even though it's billions of years away. So you're right. This is the most popular thing for people to bring up when it comes to scientific evidence that shows the universe is old.
It's
So,
compelling evidence too.
so here's the issue though, right? Um, okay, so I'll just explain it the way that people generally say it. They say, okay, if the star is billions of years away, the light takes billions of years to travel to Earth to our eyes so we can see it. Therefore, you can't have a 6,000 year creation because the light wouldn't have time to get from the star to our eyes to be able to
Right.
see it. The other thing that's brought up is that we actually see stars exploding. And so some people will say, look, if the star is exploding, that's even more evidence that God didn't just put the light there, because we're actually seeing the star exploding in our time frame, which means it had to have happened in this billions of years. Okay, so but there's a lot of problems with this. First of all, um, there is something called basically, according to scientists, cosmologists, secular cosmologists, the universe, the light has currently traveled farther than it should be able to travel. So their argument is that the universe is somewhere around 15 billion years old, but the light has traveled 28 billion light years. And so they have their own problem that's not typically brought up. It's typically ignored because it is a problem. But from that perspective, both creationists and secular cosmologists have a big problem with how light travels through space and the amount of time it takes for light to get anywhere. I would argue this, though, and I heard this from, I believe, I had a guy on recently, Russell Humphreys. He's a physicist who argues that just like God created man, didn't create man as a baby, right? He actually created him as a full-grown man. But he says something a little differently. He thinks that what happened was there was like, it's basically like a time-lapse video, that as God was making things, they were, you know how you'll do a time-lapse video of a plant growing, comes out of the ground real quick, right? Well, he says that this is how he believes God created everything. So Adam and Eve, when he created them, they went through all the stages of a development, but stopped as adults. But it went very rapidly until they got to that point, right? Whatever point that is. Same. He argues the same thing.
Have happened in terms of evolution. Just just spitballing here, right?
Yeah.
The idea of going from, this to this in this time lapse that you're suggesting in a theory, right? Could the same thing have not happened for species and mankind in general?
Well, if God used evolution, it certainly could have happened, right? But the question is not really could it have happened, because God can do things however he wants to. The question really is did God do it that way? And for me personally, in my studies, I find the evidence extremely compelling that he did not do that. Daryl Falk is a geneticist, which I find very interesting. When I was reading about that, I thought that was very interesting. I've had quite a few geneticists on my program. One of my favorite geneticists is Dr. John Sanford. He's a Cornell University professor, 27 genetic patents. He was a professor at Cornell University, had multiple business. He started in genetics, very, very, very well-credentialed geneticist. His argument is there is no way, he said genetically, it completely disproves evolution. And he has a book called Genetic Entropy. I highly recommend you read it. It's thin, it's not thick, but it is really powerful. And he shows from genetics that not only is evolution impossible, but that we had to be created recently. This is because this is what he says. He says that the human body has mutations. This is how somebody like Daryl Falk would say people evolved. They evolved through genetic mutations. The body takes advantage of those genetic mutations, creates new information in the DNA, and advances the organism. It becomes better able to survive. Survival of the fittest, natural selection. So that's what Daryl Falk would say. But what John Sanford says is that these genetic mutations are far and away harmful, not beneficial. Meaning, every time you get 10,000 genetic mutations, you might get one that's slightly positive, but the rest of them are all negative. And he says you will kill the organism far faster than you will advance the organism. And he says, based on that, honestly, we couldn't even be alive much longer than 6,000 years, because we would be producing humans that have so many genetic mutations, they literally wouldn't be able to survive. And it's interesting because I actually went and visited a geneticist. My daughter has cystic fibrosis. And I asked the geneticist. Now, this woman was just a doctor. She was a genetic doctor. She started off the conference. This is what she said to me. So she knows nothing about where I'm coming from or nothing. She's completely unbiased. She's just doing her job. So my wife and I went to see the geneticist because cystic fibrosis is caused by a genetic mutation. So she says to me, we all have many mutations in our bodies. And she said, your daughter happens to have one on both chromosomes, which means it's manifesting cystic fibrosis. She said, you and your wife are carriers. It's not manifested in you, but your daughter had a 25% chance and she got it. And we didn't know we were carriers. And I said to her, she said, now I said this because I was very curious to talk to a geneticist without any bias. So I said to her, how many good mutations are there? How many, I just was curious. What are the good mutations? Do you know of any? And she looked at me for a little bit. She thought, And she goes, I can't think of any, but I'm sure there are some because that's how we evolved, right? And I said, yeah, that's why I have problems with evolution. And she changed the subject right away. And then I said, a little bit later, I said, hey, I'm just curious because we were continuing this discussion about undirected mutations. I said, if a person had absolutely no mutations in their body, would they be extremely healthy or extremely unhealthy? Now,
Oh, what an
remember,
interesting question. Yeah.
yeah. Now, remember, evolution says that undirected mutations are what drove us to evolve. So, evolution is treating undirected mutations as very beneficial, meaning if you have a lot of them, you should be doing really, really well. On the other hand, creation says God created everything perfectly, no undirected mutations, a perfect body, and over time we've been getting progressively worse by accumulating genetic mutations. So they come from two totally different directions. And from a hypothesis perspective, so let's say we're scientists and we're hypothesizing about what we're going to find, right? From the creationist perspective, her answer should be somebody with absolutely no mutations is going to be the healthiest. But from a evolutionary hypothesis, she's going to say the person with the most mutations is going to generate the most upward evolution. Well, without me giving any background or context, she said, I guess somebody with no mutations. Just confirming what John Sanford writes in his book, which is that the accumulation of undirected mutations is actually killing the organism, not helping it move forward. And so this, along with many other reasons, is why I can't. If you also look up Dr. James Tour, he's one of the top 50 scientists in the world. He's a molecular organic synthetic chemist. He makes molecules for a living. That's what he does. He says, and he outlines this scientifically, I mean, in greater detail, probably than anybody I've ever seen. He shows why there is absolutely no way that evolution could work. And I think it would be really interesting to have Daryl Falk and Dr. Tor have a
That would be
conversation.
fantastic.
That would be really interesting. Um, but so anyway, that's for me, the scientific evidence is just overwhelmingly supportive of creation.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Well, I've
uh,
got work to do. That is a lot of that you just don't hear.
yeah, no, you don't. And it's taken me a while to accumulate this information because I just keep going after people who are scientists who are well credentialed that I feel like, hey, you're somebody I can actually have a good conversation with. But but for one reason or another, that information is not easily accessible. I mean, creation.com, AIG, ICR.org. They have a lot of science. There's a new group called Logos Research Associates, not to be confused with BioLogos, but Logos Research Associates, all PhD scientists that are creationists and give the scientific research that supports creation. But Blake, thanks for taking the time to talk. I feel like I talked
Thanks for
way too
talking to
much,
me.
but
No worries.
but anyway, if you ever want to talk more, or if you have any bump into any other questions, I'd love to shoot you some information if you're willing. So
Of course, yeah. I've got some time now in the little bit of downtime I do have to go.
I know, right? Jeez,
Yeah, we're going
I
after
can't.
it.
You are you're. I should probably like this. This will probably become some super famous interview down the road when you've got like this multi billion-dollar company or whatever you do. So
There we go.
anyway,
Yeah. Well, I'll be, I'm really excited about this because it's something for me to go ask the right questions with different people
yeah,
and go do research and studies that I'm not familiar with.
very
So yeah,
cool.
this went how I was kind of hoping it would, where I just go, huh, okay, well, haven't heard of that. And that's
Hey, that's
fantastic.
really cool. Yeah. And I think, what I really like, I really appreciate you referring me to that book because
It's pretty
what I
great.
really liked, what I really liked about it was the willingness for two people that disagree passionately to actually have a civil conversation and go, hey, what we're here for is to know the truth and we're going to do our best to get at it. Even though Daryl and Todd didn't ultimately come to an agreement, I think it was still really cool how they respectfully were able to dialogue over that. So thank you for referring that to me.
Of course, yeah, and I think the greatest thing in general is like, um, we're not going to be ever at a place where everybody's going to agree. But if we can get to a mutual respect and understanding for especially other Christians' beliefs,
Yes.
I want to destigmatize the idea of, nobody's the fool and nobody's the heretic. But instead we're both pursuing truth, and rather than, one's right and one's wrong, I like the idea of everybody knows the evidence and can draw their own conclusions.
Yes. And we all are humble and learning. I learned so much just from the people that I've had an opportunity to interview, even atheists who stumped me, and I was like, oh man, right?
What is that?
But I'm friends with them, and we have a relationship, and I'm excited to learn from them, and they're actually willing to listen and learn from me too. So, I mean, you can't beat that, right? Yeah. So awesome.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Blake. Okay. God bless you, man. Have a great night.
Have a good one. You too.
Bye-bye.
When you need tires or service, count on Conover Tires, Wheels, and Service in Oceanside for a full range of affordable options and all the brands you trust. See their great customer reviews and special offers online. Hours Tuesday through Friday, 7:30 to 5:30, and Saturdays, 7:30 to 5. Call Dan and his team at 760-439-1631. Conover Tires, Wheels, and Service, 2405 Oceanside Boulevard in Oceanside, 760-439-1631.
How can you live in San Diego and miss out on enjoying the water? Fastlane Kayaking sells popular Hobie Cat kayaks that you pedal, not paddle. That means your hands are left free for fishing and fun. Just throw these on your roof rack. They're light and they're easy to use and maintain. Just rinse them off. Try one free on a demo ride. For 36 years, Ron and Debbie Lane have served San Diego with fun, family-friendly water sports of all kinds. Learn more. FastlaneSailing.com. 619-222-0766.
Hi, this is Jason Hall, president of Team Home Loans, a branch of Synergy One Lending. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Kevin Conover for the profound impact he's had on mine and my wife's spiritual life, as well as being an incredible teacher while our kids were his students. His knowledge and passion have taught us all how important it is to be defenders of our faith. It's our honor and privilege to support Kevin and his show. It is our sincere hope and prayer that you will continue to learn to be defenders of your faith through Kevin's radio show and through his Educate for Life teachings. Thank you, Kevin, from the Hall family and Team Home Loans.
Educate for Life helps you build your life on the rock. LG Equipment helps builders build on good soil. Luke Gibson's team at LG Equipment is your local source for grading, demolition, hauling, and more. Learn about their bulk water services, from trucks to tankers to towers, at rentwatertower.com. Get your questions answered. Call LG Equipment at 619-988-0924. Learn more at lgequipment.com. 619-988-0924.